So, Courtney, why should the listeners tune into the show today?
Because we are at the precipice of a global, transformation in consciousness and in mental health and in how we treat ourselves and other people. Psychedelics are going to be and continue to be a catalyst for that, massive transformation. So I think if you're interested in improving your consciousness and health and, sort of global humanity dynamics, then psychedelics is something you should take a closer look at.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the NeuroFlex podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. Just wanted to let you guys know that NeuroFlex is going to be at the Psychedelic conference coming up in Miami at the beginning of February 2nd through 4th. We'll have a booth there, be doing brain maps and brain health education. So come say hi if you are going to be at the conference, or come to the conference if you're in the South Florida area and interested in learning about your brain and psychedelics. So on to today's episode, we have a very special guest, Courtney Barnes. Courtney is licensed to practice law in California, Colorado, and Texas. And Courtney serves as the counsel for Feldman Legal Advisors, the general counsel for SPOR, and as a policy advisor for Decriminalized Nature, and an advisory board member for Heroic Hearts Project. She was a lead drafter of the nation's first voter-initiated psilocybin policy reform ordinance and has unparalleled experience drafting local psychedelics policy reform measures. So, Courtney, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So tell me a little, what was your path to, becoming interested in psychedelics, and then in terms of the reform of the legal landscape of psychedelics?
Sure. So there's a couple of different points in my life that you could say this originated from, but my father actually was a DEA agent. So I was born overseas in Bangkok, Thailand. He was focused on sort of the illicit trafficking of opium out of Asia to the United States. So never really, preached about drugs and was pretty cool in high school and all of that. But I always have had this exposure to the war on drugs, and it definitely sort of has been a part of my DNA and upbringing. And as I got older, he actually got sick and was diagnosed with throat cancer from his service in the Vietnam War. And this was about the time when sort of medical cannabis was coming to conversation, but he refused to try it just out of the principle of illegality. And that sort of his death and sort of that natural medicine movement blooming across sort of the West Coast and other states sparked my interest in it. And I got really lucky going to law school at the University of Denver, where I got paired up with a law firm that was very focused on policy reform and actually wrote the law that legalized adult use cannabis in Colorado. And I was an unpaid intern there, saw the potential, thought it, was absolutely a dream job, and ended up staying there for 5.5 years, where I got a lot of the policy experience that I use now today to help nonprofits and advocacy organizations.
So you were actually part of the Colorado initiative, and that was Colorado, it was the first or second state, I forgot if Washington or Colorado was first in terms of legalizing.
Colorado cannabis, adult use cannabis, was the first state.
They were the first. Okay.
Yes, and I joined that firm in 2015, so it was right during implementation. And then Denver, Colorado was the first city to decriminalize mushrooms, psilocybin, and I was the lead drafter of that initiative along with Josh Capel and some others. And so that was sort of the catalyst of the psychedelics local policy reform movement we're seeing it take place across the United States.
Right. So how do you sort of contrast the experience of like the cannabis reform legalization versus now what we're seeing with like the psychedelics?
I think cannabis has done a lot of positive things for the drug policy reform movement as a whole. While when it comes to regulation and creating an industry, there's a lot of things that we can still do differently and better for cannabis. But as far as showing the world that, hey, maybe the government wasn't absolutely correct in how they categorize these compounds, and sort of opening not only that, like, gateway, but people's minds and perceptions to just, being more open-minded about how drugs are regulated, and the potential that perhaps some of these regulatory structures need revisiting and are outdated. So cannabis sort of originated in that same grassroots ground up movement at the local level with decriminalization, then this sort of patchwork state domino effect. And that's where we're seeing with psychedelics, where we had the first city in Denver in 2019 passing that decriminalization ordinance, and now we have 17 cities across the country that have passed some sort of psychedelics related drug policy reform legislation, which is pretty impressive for, under 3 years. So we're moving quite along. But I do think cannabis showed us that sort of creative pathway forward instead of waiting for the federal government to do something, showing people that we can really make an impact from this grassroots local movement.
And for the listeners, can you kind of explain like what specifically it means when, a drug is decriminalized, like say in a specific city or state?
Ooh, that's a great question that actually makes me have to clarify my language. So put very simply, drugs are regulated primarily at the federal and the state level. So drugs aren't really regulated at the city town level. There is local law enforcement that enforces laws, but the Controlled Substances Act, where sort of all of these drug regulations exist, is at the state and federal level. So technically, there is no technical decriminalization at the local level because drugs just aren't regulated there. What is more accurate to say is that these local cities have passed a deprioritization of law enforcement initiative, or prohibiting use of funds. So these ballot initiatives and ordinances and resolutions state that the city has a better use of its law enforcement resources than arresting people or adults for non-violent drug offenses. And in many cases, it also has a provision that says the city cannot use funds to arrest or prosecute these people. But technically, you could still get arrested under state or federal law. So it's not like a get out of jail free card. But in practicality, we are seeing a significant reduction in arrests, and it has the same effect as decriminalization without that sort of black letter protection. But so zoom back out to answer your kind of academic question of what's the difference between decriminalization and legalization. That's a great question. So legalization is actually the authorization of conduct. So let's say we will authorize the production of cannabis and sale of cannabis pursuant to a state license. If you have that license, you are actually allowed to do that. There's no penalties associated with engaging that conduct. Decriminalization is the removal of criminal penalties from associated conduct. So let's say they decriminalize the possession of a gram of mushrooms or psilocybin, then that would no longer be a criminal offense. You would no longer be at risk of going to jail and being criminally prosecuted and having a criminal record for engaging in possession. But you could still be fined. You can still have to do community service. It's not technically like allowed. It's just no longer criminalized. So that's the way to think of it, is at a baseline in the policy reform movement, we want decriminalization everywhere. No one should go to jail for possessing or using plant medicine.
Agreed.
But yes, and then that's like easy. I hope that everyone can agree with that. When we get into legalization, that's where we get into all these tricky questions of, what does a license look like? What's exactly allowed? How much? Who gets to do that? And that's where we're just sort of entering this new world of regulatory access with Colorado and Oregon passing. But neither of them have, really implemented yet. So it's going to be very interesting to see in 2023 as Oregon really, starts to accept and issue licenses.
Right. Because I think that's another important distinction, that decriminalization doesn't just allow anyone to just set up a business selling mushrooms on the corner. Even though I know, I don't know if you saw, there was a business, I think a dispensary in Portland that just sold mushrooms openly, maybe it was in the news like a month or so ago. I mean, they got shut down within a week or so, but there was like a line wrapping around the street corner of people just like waiting to go into this dispensary to get mushrooms.
It's true. There in Canada as well, there are a lot of shops popping up, and that is sort of what we saw with cannabis. People were being bold and, you know, taking a stance and willing to be an example. But as a lawyer, yes, it is not legal. And decriminalization is, yes, is not authorization to do anything commercial. And actually, you know, just as a less than fun or fun fact, all of the 17 cities that have passed decriminalization or deprioritization legislation don't allow commercial activity, so it's not contemplated. Oregon and Colorado will be the first states to allow the manufacture and sale of psilocybin mushrooms initially, but again, as I mentioned, Oregon's just now accepting applications, and Colorado won't be through that process until next year, I think, at least.
And eventually, once this all takes place, the applications get processed, and there start being like businesses that are, producing these products. Like, is anyone going to be able to, like, adults, like, is it going to be similar to cannabis, where you can just go into a dispensary in a state where it's legal, present your ID, and you can get whatever you want, or is it going to look different?
Unfortunately, it will be different. It is similar in many regards to medical cannabis, but you're not going to be able to take anything home. So in Oregon and initially Colorado has a bit more flexibility for future changes, but you will go to a licensed healing center and you'll be able to purchase psilocybin for use on site with the supervised and licensed facilitator. So you can't just go buy your chocolate bar and bring it home, but you will be able to purchase it legally if so long as you're an adult. And then I believe the minimum like wait time or supervision time is an hour, and that probably is dependent on dosing. So it, technically you could do a small microdose or something there, but you wouldn't be able to leave. You'd have to have that experience under supervision, and so it doesn't really make sense. It's really more formulated towards having those higher dose transformational healing journeys where you'll have someone to kind of guide you through the process and then provide you with that post and pre and post care. But you don't need a particular indication or illness or prescription diagnosis. You can go for whatever reason you'd like, so long as you're 21 years of age and older.
Okay, so that it's interesting that sort of almost a hybrid, I guess, a little bit of like recreational and medical, because like ketamine clinics, which like ketamine is like a legal, I guess not a classic psychedelic, but has psychedelic properties, right? But someone needs my understanding is they need a diagnosis of anxiety or depression or a qualifying condition to be able to do ketamine, like say an intravenous injection at one of these clinics. So is it, you think we're going to see like ketamine clinics like expanding their offerings in terms of being able to offer mushrooms or MDMA once they become legalized, or are they going to kind of be two separate things?
I think there are a lot of operators, both in cannabis and ketamine. These are kind of your trailblazers in the mental health drug space that are interested in that business concept. They'd like to be able to provide as many different modalities as they can legally. What's tricky is because ketamine is a Schedule III controlled substance, so you are allowed to prescribe it, and it can be prescribed off-label, in the doctor's best judgment that giving it to you for this purpose would outweigh the risks of giving it to you for that purpose, even though that's not what it's FDA approved for. It still goes through that DEA control, regulation, and supervision and security kind of ecosystem. So I believe there will definitely be ketamine providers that will administer MDMA. Legal place that doesn't really work. So you want to keep those totally separate.
Got it. Got it. There was just a glitch for like maybe 15, 20 seconds in the audio
Sure.
there. Um,
Can you hear me now? I
I
can repeat
can.
sort of that. Okay, sure.
Yeah,
So
if you wouldn't mind.
yeah, so the question was about whether licensed ketamine clinics would be interested or are interested in getting into the psilocybin and other psychedelic space. And that's absolutely correct. There are definitely a lot of operators that would love to expand their modality offerings. What is important though is that ketamine is a Schedule 3, so it's controlled substance. So it's regulated by the DEA, and you need to have a DEA permit to handle ketamine. Psilocybin and MDMA, primarily psilocybin, is going through two regulatory pathways. So we're having the state level, state legal, but federally illegal, akin to cannabis, regulatory structures created in Oregon and Colorado. And then you also will have, in a couple years, Compass is working through that process, I think is the furthest along. Psilocybin will be available for therapy assisted treatments at the FDA approved level. So it'll be FDA approved for treatment resistant depression initially, and then other indications. So I definitely see psilocybin in its FDA approved form, once that happens, being able to be offered in a ketamine clinic, which is also DEA regulated. But it's difficult to operate a federally legal, federally regulated drug administration business with a state legal but federally illegal business. Does that make sense? So
It
the
does.
federal match, but state and federal don't match, because we're trying to avoid the DEA at the state level, whereas they're an integral part of that regulatory process of when you get into federally approved drugs.
Right. And I mean, I think that just illustrates the complexity of like just the legal landscape of psychedelics in general. And I think it confuses a lot of people. I mean, it seems very complex. Like, what do you feel like for you, with your work, what do you feel like are some of the biggest challenges in your work to, reform psychedelic drug policy?
Sure, that's a great question. I think what big picture, as far as the theme of the biggest difficulty that comes with my vision for the future and how drugs are regulated, is that the Controlled Substances Act, so the federal and state drug regulatory foundation, it was created in 1970. It only has 5 categories of drugs, or 5 different control levels for literally every psychoactive compound that exists on the planet. And Schedule 1 is the most restrictive. It's based on essentially abuse potential. So, these drugs are deemed to have no medical value. They're not safe for use under medical supervision. The potential for abuse is high, and there's no demonstrated medical use, which is just crazy. But once you go up the scale from 2 through 5, you have less controls, but it's really all based on abuse potential. We know that your classical psychedelics really don't have any dependence liability. They're not addictive. They don't fit in Schedule 1 to begin with, but they don't fit in Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5 either. So it's really trying to create a world, and that local, state, grassroots up movement is how we're able to do this. That's a more creative approach for how we should regulate psychedelics, because on top of this sort of rigid framework that doesn't work, we have so many different uses, right? We've had thousands and thousands of years of ancestral and religious and spiritual use, and they are the ones that have really, brought these psychedelics and compounds to be accessible to us in this modern day and age. And we need to respect that lineage and those intended uses. And then we have this kind of state level regulatory access model, which we want to create, which I think will heal a lot more people, will be likely less expensive than a federally approved drug, and is equally important. And then we have the FDA drug approval path, which has always been here and is always going to be there. And there's a segment of the population that's only going to access psychedelics if they're FDA approved and in a clinical setting too. So that's all important, but we're trying to create a new sort of world that encompasses all of these different pathways, in a world that's already been operating with all of its rules and check marks and boxes that we have to try to fit into. So it's really the big structural issue. And as we talk about each level of government and the different opportunities, you see that it's like we're just trying to create a box that we should be making a new regulatory structure entirely for psychedelics, as opposed to trying to fit them within the one that already exists. But we're doing our best.
Yeah, right. So, and I know, like, I think I was at a psychedelic panel in Miami, led by Dustin Robinson, and he was talking, I think, about there had just been something in the news in terms of, I think in the state of Florida, there was a ballot initiative that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it deschedulized some of the novel psychedelic compounds, like such as like 5-MeO DMT and some other ones similar to that. Like, is that descheduling something that can be done?
So I believe, and I could be incorrect, there was a DEA action to schedule, I think, half a dozen or so new like psychedelic compounds. So they weren't on the controlled substance list already, and they deliver some of those same sort of effects. And there was a lawsuit filed to stop the DEA from just scheduling them through their kind of quick and easy, we're going to do this process, and saying, hey, wait, you guys haven't followed all the rules. You don't, this isn't appropriate. And they actually won. So they were able to prevent the DEA, at least initially, from scheduling those compounds that would be these like new novel molecules, or I'm not sure exactly what the correct term is for it, but they were able to prevent that. So it wasn't descheduling in the sense of removing, but they were able to prevent them from being scheduled, which is important. That's the one that I've heard of. Descheduling, you could potentially do at the legislative level, but it would be really difficult. The only thing we've kind of seen that happen with is hemp. So marijuana was defined as, all parts of the cannabis plant except for seeds and stems, sterilized seeds and stems, etc. And so technically it encompassed hemp as a part of the cannabis plant, and the Congress was able to remove hemp from that definition. And so that's kind of an implicit descheduling, but otherwise there hasn't been really a lot of precedent of being able to pull that off, but we're trying.
And what you're referring to there, was that the Farm Bill of like 2018?
Yes.
Yeah.
The 2018 Farm Bill was the US federal law that created a domestic hemp production program in the United States that was commercialized and changed the definition of marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act to exclude, cannabis under 0.3% THC. So it was an implicit descheduling. So it shows that we know how to do it if we want to, but what we're likely to see is this slow molecule or compound by compound FDA approval happen. So, Compass's psilocybin is going to be FDA approved and available for prescription, or, in assisted use. But psilocybin as its own compound, as it's scheduled in the Controlled Substances Act, that won't likely be rescheduled. It's usually that proprietary formula, but it remains to be seen, because the beautiful thing about psychedelics is you don't need to make a new compound that's proprietary. They work just as they were created by nature. So hopefully we'll at least start to see movement from these drug trials that shows that they have medical value. And then it's still likely going to be this patchwork local and state movement that's going to push the needle when it comes to, general perspective of these compounds throughout the United States, and getting, in a matter of 20 years, we went from total illegality of cannabis to, over 75% of the population being in favor of reform. So it shows what potential we have, but we have a long way to go.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to talk more about cannabis, and specifically like states in which it's still illegal, where you can't go into a dispensary and just purchase, classic like Delta 9 THC. A state like Florida, it's like there's all of these different products of, Delta 8 and Delta 10, and they're like all of these million sort of variations of THC that are very psychoactive. I think some not as psychoactive as conventional Delta 9 THC, some that are actually more psychoactive. So it seems kind of bizarre that like that would be able to be happening. Is that something that you think like the government is going to be cracking down upon, or is that going to be able to still exist going forward in states where cannabis is illegal?
So it's, your classic case of industry always being ahead of regulation. And technically, we have the Controlled Substance Analog Act to try to get in front of these things. So they have a pretty broad definition that's essentially if it looks like the drug, a scheduled drug, molecularly, and has a substantially similar effect, then it can be treated as a scheduled compound. And that was passed to prevent scientists from tinkering with drugs and adding a molecule to avoid scheduling and regulation. But it's a really difficult law to litigate, and it's not used all that frequently. And then there's really good arguments when it comes to cannabis and these creative compounds that go both ways. So people are arguing that, hey, hemp was excluded from the definition of marijuana. I made my Delta 8 started at CBD, which was naturally produced CBD, and therefore it doesn't matter what happens throughout the rest of the production train, it was derived from hemp. And there's arguments as a lawyer that you can make towards legality and illegality. What gives me, cause for concern is that the lack of testing on all of these highly processed compounds, is that there's all sorts of new solvents and different chemicals used to get to the final product that we're just now really seeing standardized hemp testing in the classical form of hemp. Now we're adding all of these different sort of innovative manufacturing processes and extraction processes that we don't really know if we're getting all the solvents out of them. We don't know what, residual chemicals are being left in there. And that's where it causes a lot of danger. Whereas, natural cannabis, aside from pesticides, and if you're growing your own, what's in it, and there's a lot less variable there. But in states where you don't have access to natural cannabis, and you can make the argument that, hey, this Delta 10 or Delta 8 isn't controlled and it's legal, it's just really important that you know your supplier, and you're doing that diligence, and you're able to read, request the certificates of analysis and understand the manufacturing process, make sure they're licensed, because you're putting it into your body. So it's I'm not against it, but I just think people should be careful because it's a complex production process.
Right. And definitely seems like a pretty risky business to be in terms of like with laws kind of changing, or the possibility of a law changing, and then it's like your whole production of whatever product could just be, at that point completely illegal. I wanted to ask you, like, in terms of, I'm not sure if you do like defend like individual like clients like who may have, been they're being charged with possession of a psychedelic compound, say psilocybin or LSD. And I'm curious, just like for the listeners to understand, like in most states that are, not Colorado, not Oregon, but just a standard state where it's, completely illegal, what does someone usually face going through the legal system? Not if they're selling it, but if they've just been charged, they got arrested because they were found in possession of one of these psychedelic compounds.
That's a great question, and it varies significantly state by state. So, as you mentioned, Colorado and Oregon, both have Oregon passed a decriminalization of simple possession law. So you got to look at the amounts there, but it's just I think a fine. And then Colorado just came into effect on its decriminalization provisions, which do not have a set limit, but it's implied in the definition. So there is going to be a limit eventually, but there's no limit specified. But in all the other states, and once you get past that kind of decriminalized level, it varies significantly. So in some states like Texas, you can face jail time easily regardless of how much you have. There are states where just like, the residue in a pipe or the residue in a bag, that's enough, even if it's not like quantifiably weighable, to send you to jail. And then there are other states that treat smaller amounts, so under an ounce typically, but it varies significantly from compound to compound, as a misdemeanor versus a felony. But there are some states that have very, very low possession limitations for what's considered a misdemeanor between a felony. And then they take different approaches with how they weigh compounds. So some may count not just the amount of psilocybin in the chocolate bar, but the whole weight of the chocolate bar. And that gets into tricky situations too, where you don't think that you have a lot, but because you're weighing all of the kind of medium that goes with it to take the compound, it ends up being a lot more when it comes to possession. So I can't answer that question specifically, but it is really important to look it up in wherever you live at the state level, because it varies significantly. And even in these localities where it is decriminalized or deprioritized, you're not likely to get arrested. But if you do get arrested, the consequences can be severe. And that's the truth in even like California, in places where it's a pretty liberal law enforcement approach, but the statutory penalties for engaging in the possession of a controlled substance are pretty severe. So I would say take a look at your laws wherever you live, and be thoughtful about that.
It seems pretty crazy to me that it's like, we're living in a time where it's like there's now, these like psychedelic conferences, Wonderland, and Cannabis that I mentioned in Miami, where it's like this big movement of people that are all interested in, talking about psychedelics and the benefits. But then it's like still the legal side of things is like so far behind the times. It seems like it just seems strange.
It is, but we're undoing 50 plus years of misinformation and propaganda, and sort of just the political dynamics that were at play back then. And so it takes a lot of education and effort and volunteer hours to get people to change their mind about this type of stuff. And luckily we have states, about half of them, that have ballot initiative processes. So not even every state doesn't even have an option to get a bunch of really passionate volunteers and petition across the state to make change that they want. So that's, in some states you have to go to the legislature, and that can even be a tougher battle. So it's just our structures in place to change laws are difficult. And then on top of that, drug policy reform just seems to continue to not be a priority for legislators, even though the mental health of America is the worst it's ever been. And we are sort of at the precipice of really revolutionizing psychiatry here with these natural compounds. But we also have a lot of education and data and kind of just general mindset change that we have to accomplish throughout the United States to make significant change here. And I think with that, it's also really important to value your role in this movement, whether you're attending these conferences, speaking at them, helping to advocate, talking about your experience. We're just now getting to a point where people are going to have sort of self-regulated access to some of these compounds. So it's important that we are good role models for the movement, so we don't stop it before it really takes off. And we're just about there. So I think this is awesome that you're having this podcast and asking these questions, because it is really, really important.
Right. And hopefully we won't, hopefully what happened in, the whatever 60s, 70s, in terms of psychedelic criminalization, hopefully we've learned the lessons from that and don't repeat them for this, psychedelic renaissance that's occurring now. Courtney, what would you say in terms of like the projects going forward that you're most excited about, or just what should people know in terms of psychedelic legalization movements in the coming years?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, 17 cities, San Francisco is the most recent one. I think Berkeley is going to be up if it hasn't already soon. So, that local grassroots movement is really continuing to take place. If my big call to action is really to talk about your experience. So, if you've had a medicinal experience, therapeutics, creative, spiritual, fun time, talk about your experience because that's how we're going to remove stigma. But I also want people to understand how, little, as difficult as policy change can seem, if you know a district attorney or the chief of police or a city council member in whatever town size or city size you live in, those types of connections can really make a difference. Even in Michigan, we had one district attorney, I think in Washington County, that said, hey, I'm not just send an email or send a policy statement out saying, I'm not going to prioritize and force against possession of psychedelics. They never passed any resolution or anything, but that has huge impact, and it's just an email. And just getting different people to come out and say, hey, this isn't a priority, or hey, this is how I'm okay or non-opposed. We could make impact really quickly. So that's kind of just my call to action there. But as far as what's going on across the United States to keep an eye on, Oregon, as I mentioned, is opening up their licensing applications for the first ever state legal psilocybin access program. And Colorado just passed in November of this 2022, and that will be going through the implementation process over the next couple of years. So if you're interested in, getting involved with the regulatory process, now is the time to sort of start looking at that. And then New York just introduced a bill or reintroduced to decriminalize and legalize in some cases natural medicine, so ibogaine, DMT, psilocybin, etc., which that has a lot of cool provisions in it and will be interesting to watch. And then California is also back in play with its bill from Senator Weiner to decriminalize broad scope psychedelics with certain limitations, and that almost passed in 2021. But hopefully we will be able to get it done in 2023. But all across the country, this will be a really big year for psychedelics. And there's even the potential that MDMA, the MAPS program, gets their green light to submit their drug application. I think have finished or wrapping up their phase 3 clinical trials and are just waiting on that last approval. So that could be a big domino effect as well for showing that we're starting to hit those big benchmarks.
Yes, definitely an exciting time. Well, Courtney, we're coming up onto the end of the show. So for people who really enjoyed our conversation, where can people connect with you or find out more about your work?
Sure. So if you're interested in just connecting with me or asking any questions personally, my Instagram is cbgoes_global. And then if you're interested in the regulatory space or business or corporate, transactions in cannabis or psychedelics, please look at feldmanlegaladvisors.com. That's my law firm website. And so you can reach me at either platform.
Perfect. All right, great. And then for the listeners, if you guys want to watch the video form of the podcast, that'll be on our YouTube channel, NeuroFlex on YouTube. But if you prefer listening to the audio, you can check the podcast out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about any other major audio streaming platform. So Courtney, again, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Of course, absolutely. It was my pleasure, Toby. Thank you.